From blasting two UFC judges for some of the worst scoring he's ever seen, to the fans thinking it's time to bring in the professionals. Here's what Israel Adesanya had to say about the controversial decision at UFC Vegas 74. For starters, it's personal for him. Believe it or not, this isn't exactly the first time Izzy has blasted UFC judges for some terrible scoring. He's talked about it multiple times in the past. And when it comes to Chris Lee and Sal D'Amato, the middleweight champion always expects some ridiculous judging. The last stylebender was upset about one matchup in particular. It was a high-voltage thriller between his teammate and friend Kai Kara-France and Amir Albazi. And despite outperforming Albazi in every department, the judges still didn't think Kara-France did enough and handed Amir the victory via split decision. Also, what's funny is Adesanya had shared a tweet way before the judges announced the decision. Since it was Lee and Sal on the panel, he knew it was going to be a controversial decision. The middleweight champ took to Twitter and talked about how these two guys aren't just scoring a fight. They're literally deciding a fighter's career. Just one win or loss could change everything. And since these judges have so much power, isn't it only right to hold them accountable for it all? If you ask me, I think Izzy is completely on point here. Plus, it wasn't just Israel who thought the scoring was absolutely absurd. UFC featherweight champion Alexander Volkanovski also weighed in on the discussion and talked about one round in particular. It was round number 4, and having watched the fight, I think Kai dominated in every single department. And for the judges to still give that round to Albazi is just insane. Volka was completely taken away by that decision. Israel, on the other hand, wants there to be more accountability. You know how fighters have to attend all sorts of meetings and conferences after the fight? Well, Adesanya thinks it should be the same for judges. I mean, every time a fighter loses, they're bombarded by questions about why and how it happened, and why didn't they do that special thing to win the fight? Shouldn't it be the same for judges? Shouldn't they have to explain how they scored the fight the way they did? Or look at it this way, both Adesanya and Volkanovski are blasting the judges for how they scored the bout. Maybe if there was some accountability and all of the judges had to explain their decisions, fighters wouldn't have the liberty to criticize so openly because it's all out there. In fact, if it were up to the middleweight champion, he'd want the judges to be up on the stage at the same time as the fighters, so there's an open dialogue and everything gets sorted for good. Because when you think about it, this is always going to be a blemish on Kai's and Albazi's careers. Fight fans will think one of them got robbed, while the other was wrongly favored by the judges. So one wrong decision has really long-term implications, and I think that's why Izzy's always raised his voice to bring more transparency into judging. Besides, looking at the bigger picture, judging has sort of become a bit controversial in the past couple of years. So maybe it's time they were held accountable for their doings. But that's not all Izzy had to say. He also thinks poor judging robs fighters. It might not be the most dangerous job in the world, but willingly locking yourself inside a cage with another person who'd rather die before losing is nothing short of insane. It involves putting everything on the line, and you might not agree with me, but fighters are a completely different breed. They risk everything for greatness, and to see them get robbed by 3 judges at times is just disappointing. That's what Adesanya means when he says poor judging robs fighters. It robs them of glory, money, and livelihood for their family. Plus, Izzy's probably the most qualified fighter to talk about this. He shared how challenging it is to become a top-ranked fighter at any promotion in the world. Adesanya himself spent years building himself up from scratch, and when he finally got his chance to become a champion, he did not let it go to waste. But imagine how it must feel to lose perhaps your only chance at becoming a champion. Kara-France might have not been fighting for a title or something, but in the long run, it'll affect his chances of becoming the king of the division. He's technically a fight behind now, right? So yeah, it makes total sense when Izzy talks about how one wrong decision can rob a fighter of everything. Oh, and speaking of Chris Lee, Adesanya has actually had trouble with him in the past. This was back when Marvin Vettori took on Israel for the first time at UFC Glendale. Chris Lee was one of the judges on the panel, and despite an absolutely dominant performance by the middleweight champion, Lee, for some odd reason, was the only judge who scored the fight in favor of the Italian Dream. And I know what you're thinking right now. Maybe he actually thought Vettori did enough to win the battle, but since it was a 2-1 decision, that kinda means the other 2 judges disagree with his scoring. Either way, Izzy was pretty upset he didn't get a unanimous decision, and he blasted Lee for scoring the fight in the worst way possible, since there was no way Marvin won any rounds. And for his future fights, Adesanya warned the UFC that he'd never fight again if Chris was a judge. Normally, fighters don't really have the liberty of picking who scores their fights, but when you're the king of the division with as much influence as the Nigerian, you can get away with a lot of things. Anyway, when Marvin and Adesanya fought again in a rematch with the middleweight title on the line, Chris Lee wasn't allowed to judge. As for the result of the fight, Izzy won it via unanimous decision, with all three judges scoring the fight in his favor. The last stylebender later clarified his position and said he doesn't have any disrespect at all. Well, he's still pretty annoyed Lee didn't give him the decision. But yeah, apart from that, there are no hard feelings. It's just that Israel doesn't want him anywhere near the panel when he's fighting because he has a habit of coming up with some really controversial decisions. Turning back to the Amir and Kara France fight now, did you know the fans also didn't hold back one bit? And like Adesanya, they also blasted the two judges for their messed up decision? Yep, some of them actually think these guys have overstayed their welcome. I've already shared how Izzy is fed up with Chris Lee. But did you know fans are also tired of the judges as well? Believe it or not, they actually want them to walk away now, since this is just a fight that Israel highlighted. Imagine how many fights these guys wrongly scored because of their incompetence. And before you think I'm throwing shade at them, let me quickly remind you, these aren't my words. This is what the fans are saying. One Twitter user shared how Kai Kara won in every single department, and even then, Chris and D'Amato scored against him only because they had their money placed on the other fighter. I'm not making this up, people. Some fans actually believe the reason why judges come up with such absurd decisions is that they illegally bet on the fights. Also, despite being robbed at UFC Vegas, Kai Kara France also took a shot at Lee and Sal and asked fans whether they'd seen a more terrible example of judging ever in their lives. Finally, is it about time the UFC considered ex-professionals? Honestly speaking, I think fight enthusiasts are right about this one. Who better to judge fights, other than former fighters and professionals who know everything there is to fighting? Or even if you don't want to let former fighters judge, at least bring in people who understand mixed martial arts on a deeper level, right? Because when you think about it, incidents like this one are nothing but a stain on the sport, since it not only challenges, but also damages the game's integrity. And this isn't something that just happens in the free fights. We saw how controversial the decisions have been in even some high-profile matchups, like the Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski matchup. So yeah, is Izzy right for blasting the judges? Fight fans certainly think so, and even though Kara France will never be able to change the result now, at least it might make a difference in the future when judges are more accountable for their decisions. As of right now, though, Uncle Dana couldn't care less about these matchups. Joe Rogan has raised his voice multiple times, and if he can't get through to the boss, I don't think anyone can. So, from the fans thinking it's time to bring in the professionals, to the middleweight champion blasting UFC judges, that was everything Izzy had to say about the controversial UFC Vegas 74 event.